I always thought Thanksgiving was about crowded tables, dry turkey, and family squabbles. But this year, we wanted an escape. A rustic holiday away from forced smiles and obligatory small talk. So my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far from civilization. There were 5 of us: me, Mark, Jenna, Kyle, Lisa, and Tom. We'd been inseparable in college, bonded by years of late-night study sessions and inside jokes. Life had pulled us in different directions since graduation, but this trip felt like a chance to reconnect. One perfect, peaceful weekend under the stars. The drive took hours. The pavement eventually gave way to gravel, and the gravel dissolved into dirt roads lined with towering trees. By the time we reached the clearing, the afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy in fractured rays of light. A babbling brook wound its way through the campsite, and there was just enough space for our tents. "This is perfect," Lisa said, closing her eyes and breathing in the crisp air. She was the one who'd insisted on the trip, calling it a reset after months of burnout at her corporate job. Kyle wandered off almost immediately to gather firewood, coming back with an armful of sticks and a peculiar expression. "Guys, there are symbols carved into the trees back there," he said. Jenna didn't even look up from setting up the tents. Teenagers, probably some bored kids trying to be edgy. Kyle frowned. They didn't look new, they were old, really old. Tom smirked. "So what? You think we're about to stumble into some Blair Witch stuff?" "Yeah, Kyle," I teased. "Should we leave before the ghost kids show up?" Kyle rolled his eyes and dropped the firewood beside the pit. "Forget it, I just thought it was cool." We all laughed it off, too caught up in the novelty of the trip to care. The forest felt alive, but in a welcoming way. The soft rustling of leaves, the babble of the brook, the faint chirps of birds overhead. It didn't feel threatening. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, hauling gear from the car, and preparing for our makeshift Thanksgiving dinner. Kyle got the fire going with surprising ease, and Lisa and I took over roasting the turkey. A nod to tradition even out here in the wilderness. Tom and Jenna laid out snacks and sipped cheap wine, passing the bottle back and forth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The scent of roasted turkey filled the air. We laughed and toasted to old memories, to Friendsgiving, to the kind of carefree night none of us had had in years. "I found this stone table thing earlier," Tom said suddenly, gesturing to the darkness beyond the firelight. "Flat as a pancake. We should use it to set up dinner." "Stone table?" Lisa asked. "Yeah, it's awesome. It's like ancient looking, you'll see." Curiosity got the better of us. We followed Tom through the trees, flashlights cutting through the dark. Sure enough, there it was. A waist-high stone slab, weathered and pockmarked with age. Its edges were etched with faint curving symbols, worn almost smooth. "It's like something out of a movie," Lisa said, running her fingers over the carvings. Jenna raised an eyebrow. "This feels, I don't know, weird." "It's perfect," Tom declared, already setting plates and utensils on the surface. "Let's eat." We didn't think twice. None of us asked where the altar had come from or why it was there. It was just another strange artifact in an old forest. The turkey was delicious. For a while, we forgot about the stone table, the symbols on the trees, and even the stresses we'd come here to escape. The wine flowed, stories were shared, and laughter echoed through the night. But as we started clearing up, the mood shifted. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, making the fire hiss and dance wildly. Jenna shivered and hugged her arms. "Did it just get colder?" she asked. "Temperature's supposed to drop tonight," I said, though something about the breeze felt unnatural. It wasn't just cold, it felt wrong. Then we noticed the silence. "Do you guys hear that?" Kyle whispered. "Hear what?" Lisa asked. "Exactly, nothing." The usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, were gone. The night was utterly still. The fire seemed to shrink, its light barely reaching the edges of the clearing. A low, distant rustling broke the silence. "What was that?" Jenna asked, her voice tight. "Probably just a deer," I said, forcing a chuckle. Kyle stood abruptly. "I'll grab more firewood." "I'll come with you," I offered. He shook his head. "I'll be quick." We watched his flashlight bob away, the beam cutting through the trees until it vanished completely. Minutes passed. "He's taking too long," Lisa said, worry creeping into her voice. "Maybe he got lost," Jenna said, though her tone was unconvincing. "In that case, we should find him," I said. Grabbing flashlights, we ventured into the woods, calling his name. The beams of light danced over twisted tree trunks, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Over here!" Tom shouted. We found him holding Kyle's flashlight abandoned on the ground next to a torn piece of fabric. "What the hell?" I muttered. "Maybe he fell," Lisa said, though her voice wavered. "Maybe he—" A guttural growl interrupted her. Low and deep, it resonated from the darkness. We froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, something darted between the trees, a blur too fast to make out. "Run," I said, my voice barely audible, then louder. "Run!" We sprinted back toward the clearing, but the woods had changed. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks twisting unnaturally. Paths we'd walked earlier no longer made sense. "This isn't right," Jenna cried. "We came this way." Another growl, closer this time. When we finally stumbled into the clearing, our campsite was in ruins. The tents were shredded, belongings scattered. The fire was out, smoke curling from the embers. "Is this a joke?" Lisa whispered, her face pale. "Is someone messing with us?" A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. We turned toward it, flashlights shaking in our hands. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. Then, from behind us, a whisper. "Hungry." We spun around, but there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness. "We need to stick together," I said, back to back. We formed a circle, trembling as the shadows shifted around us. Then Jenna screamed. Something yanked her into the darkness. "Jenna!" Tom shouted, rushing after her. "Wait!" I tried to grab him, but he was gone. Now it was just me and Lisa. Her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on mine. "What do we do?" "Find the car, get help." We bolted through the forest, branches slashing at our arms. The sound of pursuit was everywhere. Snapping twigs, heavy breathing, guttural growls. Then we heard it. "Mark, Lisa." We froze. It was Kyle's voice. "Kyle?" I called out, desperate. "Over here," he said. We followed the voice to the stone altar. Kyle was standing beside it, his face pale and vacant. Jenna and Tom stood behind him, their eyes blank, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Kyle?" Lisa whispered. He smiled, his teeth too sharp. "Join us." From the shadows, gaunt figures emerged, hollow-eyed, their mouths stretched wide. Lisa screamed. "Run!" I shouted, but before we could move, they were on us. Cold, claw-like hands dragged me to the altar as the symbols along its edge began to glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. I realized then that we had trespassed on something ancient, something hungry. As the creatures closed in, their whispers filled my ears. "The feast begins." Thanksgiving at the Smith residence was always a grand affair. The old Victorian house, with its creaking floorboards and tall, fogged windows, came alive each November with the warmth of family and tradition. Voices echoed through its halls, mingling with the comforting aroma of roasted turkey, spiced cider, and freshly baked pies. Evelyn Smith stood in the dining room, her hands lingering on the cornucopia centerpiece she'd crafted with care, overflowing with autumn leaves, tiny gourds, and cranberries. It was perfect, every detail in place. She glanced toward the kitchen where her husband, Richard, was carving the turkey. Their children and grandchildren chatted and laughed in the adjacent living room, the hum of familial energy filling the house like music. It should have been perfect. And yet, as Evelyn lit the final candle on the table, a strange unease crept over her, a vague chill that she quickly brushed off. Then the phone rang. The cheerful noise of the room quieted as everyone turned toward the sound. Michael, their eldest son, stood. "I'll get it," he said, moving toward the kitchen wall where the landline hung. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was calm at first, but his brow furrowed as silence filled the other end. "Hello?" he repeated, a little sharper now. "Who's there?" No answer, just the faintest click. Michael shrugged and hung up. "Wrong number, I guess." "Who still uses a landline, anyway?" Linda, his younger sister, joked. The room warmed again with laughter, the brief interruption forgotten as everyone moved to the dining table. Evelyn's unease lingered, though, her smile faltering for a split second before she sat down. But just as the family began to pass dishes around, the phone rang again. Evelyn stood this time. "I'll get it." The receiver was cool against her ear. "Hello?" A raspy whisper responded. "The turkey smells delicious, Evelyn." She froze. "Who is this?" The whisper turned into a low chuckle. "Happy Thanksgiving." The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the phone for a moment, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Shaking off her unease, she turned and forced a smile as she returned to the table. "Who was it?" Richard asked, carving knife in hand. "Just some prank call," Evelyn said, her voice tight. Linda rolled her eyes. "Kids with nothing better to do. Still, 2 calls in a row?" Michael frowned. Weird timing. "It's nothing," Evelyn insisted, waving her hand. "Let's eat." But the laughter didn't return this time, and the tension at the table thickened. The candles flickered slightly, as though the house itself were unsettled. When the phone rang a third time, Richard stood abruptly, slamming his knife down on the table. "Enough of this." He strode to the phone and yanked it off the hook. "Listen, if you don't stop..." The voice on the other end cut him off. "How's the wine, Richard?" "Still prefer the 2012 Merlot." Richard froze, his face paling. "Who the hell is this?" "You've aged," the voice whispered. "The gray suits you?" Richard slammed the phone down, his hand shaking. "Dad?" Michael said. "What did they say?" "Just some joker," Richard muttered, avoiding his wife's gaze. "We should call the police," Evelyn said. "And tell them what?" Linda scoffed. "That someone's crank calling us? Come on, it's a holiday. They're not going to do anything." The family fell silent. Then Evelyn's cell phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up. Unknown number. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Why aren't you picking up the house phone, Evelyn?" the voice whispered. Her blood turned to ice. "What do you want?" "Just enjoying the family reunion. It's been so long since we've all been together." She dropped the phone, backing away from the table. Her voice was shaky as she whispered, "They're calling my cell now." Michael jumped to his feet. "I'm calling the police." He grabbed the landline, only to slam it back down. "No dial tone," he said, his voice tight. The lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. "It's just the fuse," Richard said, though his voice wavered. Before anyone could respond, Linda's phone buzzed. The glow from the screen illuminated her pale face as she read the text aloud. "I like your blue sweater, Linda. It brings out your eyes." A collective gasp filled the room. Linda clutched at her sweater as though she could pull it off to escape the unseen eyes. "How do they know what I'm wearing?" "Everyone, stay calm," Richard ordered, though panic was clear in his eyes. "Check the doors and windows, make sure everything's locked." The family scattered, footsteps echoing through the darkened house. Upstairs, Michael climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand. Dust coated the air, and the wooden beams groaned under his weight. His light swept across the space and stopped. In one corner, a makeshift living area was set up. Blankets, neatly folded, lay beside piles of empty food wrappers and water bottles. The smell of mildew and sweat clung to the air. But what made Michael's stomach churn were the photographs. Dozens of them scattered across the floor. Pictures of the family, taken through windows and inside the house. Evelyn at the kitchen sink. Linda on the couch. Michael at the front door. "Mom? Dad? You need to see this," he called, his voice tight. Richard and Evelyn climbed into the attic. Evelyn gasped when she saw the corner, her hands flying to her mouth. "Someone's been living here," Michael said, his voice hollow. Then came a creak of footsteps behind them. They turned. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face gaunt and pale, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "Hello, family," he said. Recognition flickered in Richard's eyes. "David?" The man's smile widened. "Ah, so you do remember me." "That's impossible," Evelyn stammered. "You disappeared 20 years ago." "Not disappeared," David said. "Forgotten." Michael swallowed hard. "Uncle David?" David's expression darkened. "You all moved on so quickly. No one came looking for me. No one cared." "We thought you ran away," Evelyn cried. "Lies," David roared, his voice breaking. He stepped forward, a knife gleaming in his hand. "You left me behind, but don't worry. I've been watching, waiting, and now we're all together again." A scream erupted as David lunged. Downstairs, Linda and the others froze at the sound of it. "Mom? Dad?" Linda whispered. Then the lights went out completely. Michael stumbled down the stairs moments later, blood staining his shirt. "Run!" he shouted. "We have to get out." But the doors wouldn't budge, the windows wouldn't open. From somewhere in the house, David's laughter echoed, low and gleeful. "No one leaves," he called. "Not this time." By morning, the Smith house was silent. Neighbors, noticing the eerie stillness, called the police. Inside, the dining table was still set. Plates were untouched, food congealed on the platters. The candles had burned down to stubs. Of the family, there was no sign. Only the faint scent of roasted turkey lingering in the air. We shouldn't have been arguing, especially not on Thanksgiving. But there we were, speeding down a desolate rural road, voices raised over something so trivial I couldn't even remember what started it. "Do you have to drive like that?" Emma snapped, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "The roads are icy, Jake." "And maybe your parents shouldn't live in the middle of nowhere," I retorted, gripping the wheel harder than I needed to. The steering wheel was freezing beneath my fingers, even through the car's weak heater. "Oh, so now it's their fault we're late?" she shot back. The tension in the car was suffocating. The narrow, cracked road stretched ahead of us, vanishing into the shadows beyond our headlights. It felt like we were driving through a void, the moon hidden behind dense clouds. The trees lining the roadside loomed like silent sentinels. "You never take responsibility for anything," Emma muttered under her breath. her words sharper than the bite of the cold November air. I ignored her, my jaw tight. The road glistened faintly with patches of black ice, but I couldn't slow down. We were already late, and her parents weren't the forgiving type. The silence between us grew heavy, louder than any argument. Only the hum of the tires and the occasional creak of the suspension filled the void. Then it happened. A figure staggered into the path of our headlights. "Jake, watch out!" Emma screamed, her voice slicing through the air. My foot slammed down on the brake. The car skidded on the ice, tires screeching in protest. Time slowed as the figure, a man, turned toward us, his face pale and ghostly in the glare of the headlights. His wide, unblinking eyes seemed to lock onto mine. The impact was sickening. A dull, wet thud reverberated through the car, and the windshield spiderwebbed with cracks as his body struck it. The car swerved violently before coming to a halt on the shoulder of the road. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my chest heaving as though I'd just run a marathon. "Oh my God," I whispered, my breath fogging up the glass. "Did we just—" Emma was already fumbling with her seatbelt. "Jake, get out! We have to help him!" Her voice cracked with panic. I climbed out on shaky legs, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The trees swayed in the wind, their skeletal branches rattling. The road behind us was empty except for the crumpled figure lying motionless on the asphalt. "Call 911, I said, my voice hoarse. Emma held up her phone. "No signal." "I can't. Jake, what do we do?" Her voice rose in pitch, hysteria creeping in. I crouched down beside the man. He wasn't moving. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, and blood pooled beneath him, black in the dim light. My stomach churned. "He's dead." Emma clutched her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Number. He can't be. Maybe we can still—" "No!" I snapped, standing abruptly. My breath came out in white clouds, mingling with the steam rising from the hood of the car. "We can't stay here. We'll go to your parents' house and call for help from there. Someone else will find him." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You want to leave him here?" "Jake, we hit him. This is our fault." "And what do you want me to do?" I shot back, louder than I intended. "We can't help him now. Do you want us to freeze to death out here too?" Emma hesitated, her lips trembling. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. We climbed back into the car. The drive to her parents' house was silent, but not the comfortable kind. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, made you feel like you couldn't breathe. Emma stared out the window, her face pale and streaked with tears. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. When we pulled into her parents' driveway, the warm glow of their house felt alien. The windows were lit up, and I could see silhouettes of people laughing and moving inside. It felt wrong, too cheerful, too normal. My chest tightened. Her mother opened the door before we could knock. "There you are," she said brightly, pulling Emma into a hug. "We were starting to worry. Happy Thanksgiving." "Happy Thanksgiving," Emma murmured, her voice flat. Her father clapped me on the shoulder as we stepped inside. "Rough drive?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, long night." The house was cozy and smelled like roasted turkey and spiced cider. Normally, the scent would have made my mouth water, but tonight it turned my stomach. I couldn't stop replaying the thud of the man's body hitting the car. At the dinner table, Emma barely touched her plate. I wasn't much better. The conversations around us blurred into white noise. Halfway through dinner, the news played quietly on the television in the adjacent room. A phrase caught my ear. A hit-and-run incident on County Road 12. Authorities are asking anyone with information. Emma's fork clattered against her plate. Her hands trembled as she stared at me. Her mother frowned. "Honey, are you feeling all right?" "I need some air," Emma muttered, pushing back her chair. I followed her out onto the porch. The air was colder now, the sky darker than before. Emma stood on the steps, hugging herself. "We should have stayed," she said, her voice barely audible. "We should have helped him." "What good would that have done?" I snapped, the guilt in my chest twisting like a knife. "He was already dead." Her gaze flicked to the car parked in the driveway. "Jake, what's on the windshield?" I turned. My stomach dropped. Scrawled across the cracked glass in streaks of something dark and wet were the words, "I saw you." A metallic scraping sound echoed from the side of the house. Emma grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" "It's probably just a branch," I said, though my voice was unconvincing. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate drag, like nails scraping against wood. Inside, the lights flickered, then went out completely. Her father's voice called from the living room. Must be the fuse box. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her face going pale. "It's a text from his number." I snatched the phone from her. The message read, "I'm here." The scraping grew louder, now joined by faint knocking on the windows. Her father returned from the basement, shaking his head. "Nothing wrong with the fuse box. It must be the storm." "Who's outside?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "No one," I said quickly. "Let's all stay together." But then the knocking turned into pounding. The front door rattled violently. Her father moved to open it. "Wait!" I shouted, but he was already turning the knob. The door flew open. There was no one there, just the cold wind and the empty night. Then, behind us, a shadow moved. We turned. Standing in the living room was the man from the road. His head still hung at that grotesque angle, and his face was ashen, his eyes black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. "You left me," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. Emma screamed. Her mother clutched her chest. Her father stepped forward. "Get out of my house." The man smiled, a horrifying, broken grin. "You can't make me leave. I'm already dead." The air grew colder, freezing the breath in my lungs. I couldn't move. The man pointed at me and Emma. "Justice for what you took." I fell to my knees as an unbearable weight pressed down on me. My vision blurred, the room spinning. Emma cried out, reaching for me, but her screams faded into the growing darkness. The last thing I saw was his smile, and then nothing.